I give you just 3 minutes to tell me where that hiding place is. He put his watch down on the table. 3 minutes, Mrs. Thomas Beresford. The clock above the fireplace ticked. Tuppence sat quite still, with a blank, expressionless face. It didn't show the thoughts racing behind it. In a flash of understanding, she saw everything, and realized at last who was the centre of the whole organisation. It came as quite a shock to her when Haydock said, 10 seconds more. As if in a dream, she watched him, saw the arm holding the pistol rise, heard him count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He had reached 8 when the shot rang out, and he collapsed forward on his chair, a puzzled expression on his broad red face. He had been so focused on watching his victim that he had been unaware of the door behind him opening. In a flash, Tuppence was on her feet. She pushed her way past the uniformed men in the doorway and took hold urgently of an arm belonging to someone she knew. Mr. Grant! Yes, my dear. It's all right now. You've been wonderful. Tuppence ignored these reassurances. Quick! There's no time to lose. You've got a car here? Yes. He stared at her. A fast one? We must get to Sans-Souci at once. If only we're in time, before they telephone here and get no answer. 2 minutes later, they were in the car, and it was making its way through the streets of Leatherbarrow. Then they were out in the open country, moving fast. Mr. Grant asked no questions. He was content to sit quietly whilst Tuppence watched the speedometer in an agony of fear. The driver had been given his orders, and he drove with all the speed the car was capable of. Tuppence only spoke once. Tommy? He's quite all right. He was rescued half an hour ago. She nodded. Now at last they were nearing Leahampton. The car raced and twisted through the town, then up the hill. Tuppence jumped out, and she and Mr. Grant ran up the drive. The hall door, as usual, was open. There was no one in sight. Tuppence ran lightly up the stairs. She glanced inside her own room as she passed it, and noted the open drawers and untidy bed. She nodded to herself and passed on along the upper hall and into the room occupied by Mr. and Mrs. Cayley. The room was empty. It looked peaceful and smelt slightly of medicines. Tuppence ran across to the bed and pulled at the coverings. They fell to the ground, and Tuppence put her hand under the mattress. She turned triumphantly to Mr. Grant with a well-worn child's picture book in her hand. Here you are. It's all in here. What on earth? They turned. Mrs. Sproat was standing in the doorway staring at them. And now, said Tuppence, let me introduce you to M. Yes, Mrs. Sproat. I should have known all along. It was left to Mrs. Cayley, arriving in the doorway a moment later, to introduce the appropriate anticlimax. Oh dear, said Mrs. Cayley, looking with dismay at her husband's bed. Whatever will Mr. Cayley say? Chapter 14. I should have known all along, exclaimed Tuppence. She was calming her nerves with a large glass of brandy, and was smiling broadly at Tommy and Mr. Grant and Albert, who was sitting with a pint of beer and grinning from ear to ear. Tell us about it, Tuppence, urged Tommy. You first, said Tuppence. There's not much for me to tell, said Tommy. A complete accident in Haydock's bathroom led me to the secret wireless transmitter. I tried to pretend I thought it must have belonged to Hahn, the previous owner of Smugglers, but Haydock was too clever for me. Tuppence nodded and said, He telephoned Mrs. Sproat at once, and she ran out into the drive and waited for you. After that, said Tommy, the credit belongs entirely to Albert. He was investigating around Haydock's place because it was the last place I'd been. I did some intense Morse code snoring, and he understood it immediately. He went off to Mr. Grant with the news, and the two of them came back late that night. I did some more snoring. The result was that I agreed to remain in the cellar so that we could catch the people in the boat when it arrived. Mr. Grant added his part of the story. When Haydock went off this morning, our people took charge at Smuggler's Rest. We captured the boat this evening. And now, Tuppence, said Tommy, your story. Well, to begin with, I was the biggest fool all along. I suspected everybody here except Mrs. Sproat. Then Tommy disappeared. I was just getting a plan together with Albert when suddenly Anthony Marsden arrived. He seemed all right to begin with. He was the usual sort of young man that Deborah often has around. But two things made me think a bit. First, I became more and more convinced as I talked to him that I had never seen him before, and that he had never been to the flat. The second thing was that, though he seemed to know all about my working at Leahampton, he assumed that Tommy was in Scotland. Now, that seemed all wrong. If he knew about anyone, it would be Tommy, since I wasn't here officially. That seemed very strange to me. Mr. Grant had told me that fifth columnists were everywhere. So why shouldn't one of them be working in Deborah's department? I was suspicious enough to lay a trap for him. I told him that Tommy and I had fixed up a code for communicating with each other. I told Anthony we used the saying penny plain, tuppence coloured in letters, and said we spelt plain as P-L-A-Y-N-E. As I hoped, he believed it completely. I got a letter this morning which gave him away totally. I'd worked out all the arrangements with Albert beforehand. All I had to do was to pretend to be ringing up a dressmaker to cancel a fitting, but really I was phoning Albert to let him know that Anthony was a traitor, and that N or M, or both of them, wanted to know more about me and what I knew. It gave me a shock, said Albert. I drove up with a baker's van, and we poured a pool of aniseed just outside the gate. And then, Tuppence took up the story, I came out and walked in the aniseed. Of course it was easy for the baker's van to follow me to the station, and then someone else, who was also following me, came up behind me and heard me book a ticket to Yarrow. It was after that it might have been difficult. The dogs we'd brought followed the smell of the aniseed well, said Mr. Grant. They picked it up at Yarrow Station, and again on the track the tyre had made, after you kicked your shoe on it. It led us down to the trees and up again to the stone cross, and where you had walked over the hills. The enemy had no idea we could follow you easily, after they had seen you set off walking and had driven off themselves. All the same, said Albert, it made me very worried, knowing you were in that house, and not knowing what might be happening to you there. We got in a back window, and caught the foreign woman as she came down the stairs. We came in just in time to save you. I knew you'd come, said Tuppence. The thing was for me to keep things going as long as I could. What was really exciting was the way I suddenly saw the whole thing, and what a fool I'd been. How did you see it? Asked Tommy. Goosey, goosey, gander, said Tuppence promptly. When I said that to Commander Haydock, he went absolutely mad. And not just because it was silly and rude. No. I saw at once that it meant something to him. And then there was the expression on that German woman's face. Anna, it was like the Polish woman's. And then, of course, I thought of King Solomon, who ruled Israel thousands of years ago, and I saw the whole thing. Tommy gave a sigh of exasperation. Tuppence, if you say that once again, I'll shoot you myself. Saw or what? And what on earth has Solomon got to do with it? Do you remember that two women came to Solomon with a baby, and both said it was hers, but Solomon said, "Very well, cut it in two," and the false mother said, "All right," but the real mother said, "No, let the other woman have it." You see, the real mother couldn't face her child being killed. Well, the night that Mrs. Sproat shot the other woman, you all said what a miracle it was, and how easily she might have shot the child. Of course, it ought to have been quite clear then. If it had been her child, she wouldn't have risked that shot for a minute. It proved that Betty wasn't her child, and that's why she absolutely had to shoot the other woman. Why? Because, of course, the other woman was the child's real mother. Tuppence's voice shook a little. Poor thing. Poor hunted thing. She came over to England as a refugee, with nothing, and so she was grateful when Mrs. Sproat asked if she could adopt her baby and gave her money. But why did Mrs. Sproat want to adopt the child? Camouflage! It would be hard to believe that a master spy would involve her child in the business. That's the main reason why I never considered Mrs. Sproat seriously, simply because of the child. But Betty's real mother had a terrible longing for her baby, and she found out where Mrs. Sproat was living and came down here. She waited around for her chance, and at last she got it and went off with the child. Mrs. Sproat, of course, was terribly worried. At all costs, she didn't want the police to get involved, so she wrote that message and pretended she'd found it in her bedroom. And she made sure Commander Haydock was brought in to help. Then, when we tracked down the poor woman, Mrs. Sproat couldn't risk being discovered, so she shot her. She pretended not to know anything about firearms, when, in fact, she was a very fine shot. Yes, she killed that poor woman, and because of that, I've no pity for her. She was bad through and through. Tuppence paused. Then she went on. Another thing that ought to have given me a hint was the likeness between Van der Polonska and Betty. It was Betty the woman reminded me of all along, and then the child's strange play with my shoelaces. How much more likely that she'd seen her mother do that, not Carl von Dynam. But as soon as Mrs. Sproat saw what the child was doing, she placed a lot of evidence for us to find in Carl's room, and added the master touch of a shoelace soaked in secret ink. I'm glad that Carl wasn't involved, said Tommy. I liked him. He's not been shot, has he? Asked Tuppence anxiously, noting the past tense. Mr. Grant shook his head. He's all right, he grinned. As a matter of fact, I've got a little surprise for you there. Tuppence's face lit up as she said, I'm terribly glad, for Sheila's sake. Of course we were idiots to suspect Mrs. Perenna. She was mixed up in some IRA activities, nothing more, said Mr. Grant. I suspected Mrs. O'Rourke a little, and sometimes the Cayleys. And I suspected Bletchley, put in Tommy. And all the time, said Tuppence, it was that silly creature we just thought of as Betty's mother. Not exactly silly, said Mr. Grant. A very dangerous woman and a very clever actress, and, I'm sorry to say, English by birth. Tuppence said, Then I've no pity or admiration for her. It wasn't even her own country she was working for. She looked at Mr. Grant. Did you find what you wanted? Mr. Grant nodded. It was all in that old collection of children's books. The ones that Betty said were nasty? Tuppence exclaimed. They were nasty, said Mr. Grant dryly. Little Jack Horner contained very full details of our naval operations. Johnny Head in Air did the same for the Air Force. Details of the Army were appropriately hidden in There was a little man and he had a little gun. And Goosey Goosey Gander? Asked Tuppence. Mr. Grant said. That book contains, written in invisible ink, a full list of all the important people who have agreed to assist in an invasion of this country. Among them were 2 chief constables, an air vice-marshal, 2 generals, the head of an armaments works, a cabinet minister, many police superintendents, commanders of local volunteer defense organizations, and various military and naval junior officers, as well as members of our own intelligence force. Tommy and Tuppence stared at him. Incredible, said Tommy. Grant shook his head. You don't understand the force of the German propaganda. It appeals to something in a man, some desire for power. These people were ready to betray their country not for money, but in a kind of superior pride in what they themselves were going to achieve for that country. In every other country it has been the same, and you can see that with such people able to issue contradictory orders and confuse operations, the invasion would have had every chance of succeeding. And now, said Tuppence. Mr. Grant smiled. And now, he said, let them come. We'll be ready for them. Chapter 15. Darling, said Deborah, as they sat at a table in the ballroom of the Ritz Hotel in London. Do you know, I almost thought the most terrible things about you. Did you? Said Tuppence. When? Her eyes rested lovingly on her daughter's dark head. That time when you went off to Scotland to join Father, and I thought you were with Aunt Gracie. I almost thought you were having an affair with someone. Oh, Deb, did you? Not really, of course. Not at your age. And of course I knew you and Father are devoted to each other. It was really an idiot called Tony Marsden who put it into my head. Do you know, Mother, they discovered he was a 5th columnist. Did you like him at all? Tony? Oh, no. He was always so boring. Oh, I must dance to this tune. I love it. She floated away in the arms of a fair-haired young man, smiling up at him sweetly. Tuppence followed their movements for a few minutes. Then her eyes looked over to where a tall young man in Air Force uniform was dancing with a slim, fair-haired girl. I do think, Tommy, said Tuppence, that our children are rather nice. Here's Sheila, said Tommy. He got up as Sheila Perenna came towards their table. She was dressed in a bright green evening dress, which showed up her dark beauty. It was an unhappy beauty tonight, and she greeted her host and hostess rather ungraciously. I've come, you see, she said, as I promised, but I can't think why you wanted to ask me. We have a nice partner for you to dance with, said Tommy, smiling. I don't want to dance. You will like the partner we've asked to meet you, said Tuppence, grinning. Sheila began, then stopped, for Carl von Dinem was walking across the floor. You! I myself, said Carl. There was something a little different about Carl von Dinem this evening. Sheila stared at him. The colour had come to her cheeks, turning them a deep, glowing red. She said breathlessly, I thought they would keep you interned. Carl shook his head. There is no reason to intern me. You have got to forgive me, Sheila, for lying to you. I am not, you see, Carl von Dinem. I took his name for reasons of my own. He looked questioningly at Tuppence, who said, Go ahead, tell her. Carl von Dinem was my friend. I knew him in England some years ago. I renewed my friendship with him in Germany just before the war. I was there then on special business for this country. You were in British intelligence? Asked Sheila. Yes, and I had some very near escapes. My plans were known when they should not have been known. I realized that the service had traitors in it. Carl was not a Nazi. He was interested only in his job. A job I myself had also worked at, research chemistry. He decided shortly before war broke out to escape to England. His brothers had been sent to concentration camps. There would, he thought, be great difficulties in the way of his own escape, but in an almost miraculous way all these difficulties were resolved rather effortlessly. That fact, when he mentioned it to me, it made me suspicious. Why were the authorities making it so easy for von Deinem to leave Germany? It seemed as though they wanted him in England for some reason. My own position was becoming increasingly dangerous. Karl's lodgings were in the same house as mine, and one day I found him, to my great sadness, lying dead on his bed. He had become depressed and had taken his own life, leaving a letter behind which I read and kept. I decided then to pretend to be Karl. I wanted to get out of Germany, and I also wanted to know why Karl was being encouraged to do so. I dressed his body in my clothes and laid it on my bed. His face was disfigured by the shot he had fired into his head. With Karl von Deinem's papers, I travelled to England and went to the address to which he had been recommended to go. The address was Sans Souci. While I was there, I played the part of Karl von Deinem. At first, I thought that I should be made to work for the Nazis. I realized later that the part for which my poor friend had been chosen was that of scapegoat. When I was arrested on false evidence, I said nothing. I wanted to reveal my own identity as late as possible. I wanted to see what would happen. "You should have told me," Sheila complained. He said gently, "If you feel like that, I am sorry." His eyes looked into hers. She looked at him angrily and proudly. Then the anger melted. "I suppose you had to do what you did. Darling, come and dance." They moved off together. Tuppence sighed. "Why did he search my room that day? That led us in completely the wrong direction." Tommy gave a laugh. "I believe he thought Mrs. Blenkinsop wasn't a very convincing person. In fact, while we were suspecting him, he was suspecting us." "Hello, you two," said Derek Beresford, as he and his partner danced past his parents' table. "Why don't you come and dance?" He smiled encouragingly at them. "They are so kind to us, bless them," said Tuppence, praying to herself. "Oh, keep them safe. Don't let anything happen to them." She looked up to meet Tommy's eyes. He said, "About that child, will we—" "Betty? Oh, Tommy, I'm glad you've thought of it too. I thought it was just me being motherly. You really mean it?" "That we should adopt her? Why not? She's had a very bad start in life, and it will be fun for us to have someone young growing up with us." "Oh, Tommy!" She stretched out her hand and squeezed his. They looked at each other. "We always do want the same things," said Tuppence happily. Deborah, passing Derek on the floor, murmured to him, "Just look at those two, actually holding hands. They're rather sweet, aren't they? Poor things. They are having such a boring time in this war. I think we really must try to put more fun and excitement into their lives."